But I think for teachers, we're comfortable with building those habits in person, and we maybe pull out our dry erase board or whatever it is. What are some general strategies that you might recommend for trying to build fluency online?
Awesome. So things like space practice work, things like quick writes work to activate the things you already know. So I think we could look at both skills and concepts in terms of fluency. There are some skills we have and some concepts we have. So things like space practice, mnemonics can be useful in building, reminding us for fluent behavior. You named one just now. So there's those practices. So as you said, social studies, I was thinking about this when you're a novice in understanding history and you are introduced to, for example, ancient Rome, you tend to think the rest of the world stopped and here's what we're learning about ancient Rome. As you become more sophisticated, you understand multiple world events can occur at the same time. And you start to be able to visualize more of a timeline that has depth to it. There are things happening in the world at the same time. So while the French Revolution was occurring, there were other things happening in the world. We just happen to teach this because it's a super important moment in world history. So the fluent behavior there is, can I activate my knowledge of time and different locations? Am I using my historical thinking skills? Like, am I looking for bias? Am I recognizing primary source, secondary source? All of that's getting activated. So to use a history example, if students understand the difference between primary and secondary sources, we can build that into the lesson. So here's a primary source, here's a secondary source, and here's how you're going to use these two in today's lesson around X.
Excellent. And then the challenge round though, I don't know if we got there. How do we do that online? And I don't expect you to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of these teachers that we're going to be dealing with, they already did some of this in the spring, but just so like without naming, like we use in our middle school we use IXL, and we have in Khan Academy might be another one. Would you say things like
Yep.
that are is that the kind of thing that you think people should look for if they're trying to build, like you say, space practice or something like that?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So in the online environment, I worry that we're going to say to students, here's all the work, all the practice work you have to do, rather than say, you're going to do X, 2 or 3 today, you're going to do 2 or 3 tomorrow, you're going to come back and do 2 or 3 the next day and the next day. That spaced practice, returning to it over and over again, is reinforcing and building that fluency. We don't give them 25 math problems to do all one night. We start to add new kinds of problems while they're still doing previous problems. That's also called spiral review, is we're spiraling back and maintaining that fluency while we're learning new stuff.
I think that's a great example, and I don't want to tell too much of my own story, but my son learned his times tables as a third grader during the quarantine. And my wife said, "Does he know his times tables?" And I said, "Well, of course he does." And I said, I gave him 6 times 6, 6 times 7. I gave a couple, he rattled them off. Well, a couple weeks went by, and he was learning division, and he was stumped on like, well, 24 divided by 3, whatever. He because he could not remember those things that I thought, well, we learned that, but we didn't continue to practice that skill, and it atrophied, So I, I appreciate what you're saying there. Um, Not having fluency, you talk about as you could be thought of as disfluent performance, and we know some of our students have a hard time under normal circumstances, and I think that as educators we worry about it's going to be so hard to serve those students. But for any student, if they have a disfluent performance of discrete skills, is the full phrase that was out of your book. If you have that disfluent performance, what's the danger there? How does that handicap a person?
It ruins their working memory for the new stuff because their brain goes back to this. I don't get this part. The assumption that when we think you're fluent, to use your example, we think you're fluent in multiplication, that you can do that and then reverse it to divide. But if not, then your brain goes back there and you become stuck or stymied and you can't do the new stuff because that is not fluent. So your brain starts to try to say, well, what is 12 divided by 4? What is something times 4 that would be 12? And your brain goes there, not up here. And so it challenges working memory. And you start to doubt yourself. You start to, you get into this mindset, I can't do this, I don't understand this, which starts to become, I'm not a good student, I'm not good at math, history, writing, whatever. So we have to make sure that we're providing that needed instruction to maintain or practice the fluency so that it opens doors for other kinds of thinking, more around strategic thinking and struggle.
Okay. I think that was a lot of what I was hoping to bring up on fluency, but are there some other maybe big picture things that you think would be important for us to keep in mind, or do we cover it pretty well?
I think we covered it well. I would close by saying, don't undervalue fluency or automaticity. Everything we teach, if we care enough about it, should eventually end up in that quadrant.
I,
That's what creates the independent, the transfer.
I'm glad you reminded me of that, and that was a point in your book that it's great to graduate up and eventually get to struggle and to get mastery in that quadrant. But the goal is, if we're trying to get to transference, that they can sit at the adult table and they can have those conversations, or they can rattle out that math equation. It needs to become somewhat automatic. So maybe that's something for us to think about as
Yes.
teachers. Like you talked about, trying to be cyclical a bit. As we get over some giant mountain, whatever it may be, we need to make sure as we go into the next thing that skill remains strong and remains fluent, like you say.